Today, we're going to start off by creating landscapes, talking about landscapes, how to set that up, how to start. And we're going to start a landscape together, and we're going to do a couple exercises on creating landscapes. So the supplies that we need for today are just very simply our pastels. I'll be demoing with some oil pastels and some soft pastels. So whichever pastels you have are going to be perfect to use. And I'm going to be using some watercolor paper, but whatever paper you have will also work. The best paper for pastels are going to be the papers that have really rough surfaces. They hold on to that pastel pigment best. And so papers like pastel paper, like mixed media paper or watercolor paper, those are going to be the better ones. But you can use any paper. Today we're going to be kind of trying I feel like I've been saying play a lot, but I feel like we are going to play today. Just kind of experiment with our tools and processes. And so this is just this is not to make a beautiful finished piece. This is to try out some different techniques today. So any paper you have works. I also have on hand, I have a couple Q-tips and my tortilla. I'm going to be using probably my finger the most to do some smudging and blending. But if you don't want to get messy using something like the tortilla and a blending stump or Q-tip, that'll work well. No, you don't have to have that. You can definitely just use your fingers or a scrap of paper that you can use to kind of blend that out. All right. So again, our supplies are very simply the pastels, paper, and something to blend with, whether it's your finger or the supplies. I think it's important to discuss this whenever we talk about creating a landscape or creating like a naturescape, right? And it's atmospheric perspective. It's not important to know this term at all, but what this idea is that the closer something is to you, the more detail you see. The further away it is from you, the less detail you see. And so here are a couple landscapes that I drew for a handout that we can kind of see that in color and in black and white. With this color one, you see that there's more saturation of color towards the bottom. This is the part of that landscape that's closest to us. So we see the darkest darks and the lightest lights. We see the widest range of color. We see the most detail. And then the further back it goes, you can see like here we see a tree line, but we don't see a lot of detail with that. That first mountain, we see a little bit of range of color, but not a lot of, it's hard to tell if trees are there or not. And then basically after that point, we're just seeing these solid planes of color, but it's losing saturation and detail as it goes, right? And so with the black and white, it's that same way. You see the darkest darks, the lightest light, those are going to be closest to you. And then the further back you go, the less saturated, the less detail you see. So it works with color and it works with black and white. Now these are definitely like large scale landscapes. So when you're doing something like your yard, or a park that you're sitting in, it'll look a little different, but that idea is the same. It's still seeing the stuff that's closest to you, you're going to see more detail. The stuff that is further away from you, you see less detail. And so this is really handy to kind of keep in mind as we're doing our landscapes. I will say, you can follow this, keep this in mind and create your landscape in this way and have an excellent landscape drawing. But you can also ignore this and still have a successful landscape drawing. So just throwing that out there too. These tips are helpful if you use them, but you don't have to. So just to kind of continue that idea of atmospheric perspective, and the closer something is to you, the more detail you see, the more color. I'm going to come down just a little bit so we can see these two images here. So these are just a couple examples. We're going to kind of start off by looking at these and kind of creating our own version of these in our session today. But starting out, looking at this one here, this is a great example of landscape as well. You can see that this first part here, there's a lot of detail, even though it's just grass. We see a lot of like the individual blades. You see a lot of transition in color. right? Even though it's just green, there's a wide variety of green that we see, right? And so that's this kind of close first section. When we move further back, you can see this kind of section here. That's just a couple planes of color. You don't see as wide a variety right here. You see some lighter greens, right? A little detail. And then later on in this section here, you see even less detail, fewer details, right? It's mostly one or two planes of color, right? And even the tree has detail in it, but it's nowhere near the amount of detail that we see here, right? Here we see those individual blades of grass. The tree, it's just little splotches of color. You don't see those leaves. We don't see the bark, right? It's further away. With this one too, we can see that probably a little clearer. There are a couple sections that have a lot of detail, and as we go further back, we lose some of that detail. Here, this first section, this triangle shape, we see a lot of individual flowers, blades of grass. There's a lot of variation in color. We see individual, maybe not individual petals, but the individual flowers, right? We can see the wide variety of color here. And in that second section, this part right here, we don't see those individual pieces of grass or flowers anymore. We see kind of a little bit of that purple, just kind of a plane of purple, right? We don't see that detail. And we kind of lose that further, the further back we go. This tree here is right on the edge of that main detail, that first part. And so we're going to see a lot of individual pieces, like hunks. We see more detail in this tree than we do in this tree. And it's because this one is closer to us. So it still follows that atmospheric perspective, right? So we're going to start off by creating our own drawing today, kind of inspired by one of these here. And I think the best way to learn how to do a landscape or how to start a landscape is to actually play around and try it. So that's what we're going to do. But there are a couple things, a couple tips that I want to start off talking about. A good first step when it comes to creating landscapes is to think about the largest shapes, right? So for example, I'm going to use a red pencil here. So the largest shapes, when I talk about large shapes, I'm going to talk about this one down here. I'm going to use a red pencil to kind of help mark that so it's a little easier to see. But we're going to talk about the largest shapes, right? We're going to leave the detail for last. Whenever you're doing drawing, painting, like mark making, it's always great to leave that detail for last. Start with those basic shapes and gradually build on that. Gradually add that color in, add those details in. And so to start, if I'm doing this landscape here, I'm going to think about those biggest shapes. So that first shape is right here. This is that darkest color. We can see that first shape. That second shape is kind of here. Right? Then we see further back and further back. Right? We also see a tree. So these are our basic shapes when we're kind of constructing this piece. So if I am drawing this image here, I'm going to think about these shapes, kind of filling them in gradually, right? Main reason I like starting with like these basic shapes and working towards detail is it makes the drawing a little less intimidating. Right? When we look at it originally, we see a lot going on. We see the individual leaves, we see flowers, we see a bunch of color. But when we break it down to these individual shapes, it makes it a little more manageable for us, right? So that's kind of where we're going with this. We start with those basic shapes. And then we start thinking about the color. I want us to kind of take a look at the color that we're seeing in our image here, right? Some of the main colors that we're noticing are like greens, yellows, browns. We're not seeing bright greens like we are in this image, but we're seeing more like muted, earthier tones, right? There's different purples and pinks that we see in the flowers. There's a variety of greens, a little bit of red in those flowers. And then if we look down here, this first section is a shadow, right? But there's no black in that shadow. If we look really closely, those colors that we see are dark purples, are navies, are dark greens. And so like, um, one of the things, I think I mentioned it last time too, is when you're doing these landscapes, or any like drawing, notice the colors that you wouldn't expect to be in the drawing. Like when we're drawing grass, we don't necessarily expect to have purples and blues in the grass. But when we look deeper, really pay attention, really observe, really notice, we start to see those colors coming in, those reds in the grass, those navies, those purples. We start to see that more clearly. This is the one I'm going to start drawing off of today, just to kind of start our process. And this one seems there's a less variety in color, so it may be a little easier to start with this one today. We're not going to copy this one exactly, but we're going to kind of be inspired by this one today in our first drawing. So I want us to kind of take a look and notice the color change here. Okay. So you can see some of the detail. We're looking at this first section here, just this first section. So we can see some of the detail. We see some dark lines. We see some navies and some dark greens, but we also see some really light greens and some yellows. Okay? Um, and one thing that you'll notice is that you can kind of tell where that light is coming from, right? Because we see some of the rays coming this way, we see the light on the top here. So the darker parts are on that underside of the grass. So noticing where the light is very helpful when it comes to creating that drawing. We see the light on those, the tops kind of in rows, right? So we have our main section here. We also have kind of a second section here that we're going to look at. And then we have a tree. We're going to ignore the sky today, but we're mostly focused on setting up that ground today. So we're going to do basically 3 sections. We're going to have our most detailed section. We're going to have a little faded, less detail, less color range, and then we'll do our tree. One of the things I want to ask us to kind of keep in mind, not just that atmospheric perspective, thinking about the detail being closest to us, losing detail and color the further back we go, is to think about the color range, right? What colors you're noticing here. Now, again, we're not copying like exactly. We're kind of being inspired by this and creating our own landscape based off of this image. I also want to remind us of last time working, how we use those different processes, right? Those different techniques. We used scumbling, that mark making. We used layering, where we were adding colors on top of colors, right? We did some blending and smudging, where we were mixing those colors together, and doing some stippling. So we have a wide range of techniques that we practiced last week, that we can pull in to this week as well. So I'm going to start off, just because it's easier for me. You don't have to do this, but I'm going to start off by creating a square. It's easier for me to kind of work in. And so I'm going to notice my mid-tone color. Now, it's not always required that you work with midtones first, but I always find it's a little easier to work with midtones and then add those lighter and darker colors. And so I'm going to notice where my mid-tone colors are mostly. Here, there's in the second section, there's a lot of light colors. So my mid-tone is basically down here. So I'm going to take my mid-tone green and my soft pastel and my mid-tone green and my oil pastel, and I kind of create that first shape. Right? And so I'm just going to kind of add it in, and definitely want to invite you to do that as well. That kind of mid-tone green. I'm going to do it with that oil pastel too. You can see I'm not doing an intense block of color, just kind of giving that little bit of color there. And so this mid-tone is like that base where we're kind of starting, right? And so what I want to do, and again, this is a process that helps me. And I think it's good to kind of practice this so you know kind of the best techniques and ways that feel best to you when you're creating it. But I'm going to take my finger and just kind of smudge that first layer in, creating that base layer, okay? And I'm going to do that with this one too. that mid-tone is the base that I'm going to be working off of. Okay. So this is that starting place. We worked on that background, right? Now we're going to kind of build off of it. Yep. So I'm going to kind of bring in some yellows and light greens. If you have just a basic like 8 or 12 color palette, pastel palette, just pulling out like a regular yellow will work. If you have more colors, doing like a light green will work too. But it's starting to notice where those lightest colors are, right? So I'm going to use a light green for my soft pastel here. And I'm just going to kind of notice those light colors and kind of bring them through in my drawing here. Just kind of start building that up, right? Just kind of noticing where those highlights are, right? Ooh, and just kind of building that up. And again, we're not doing a whole lot of detail right now. Right? We're working on those basic shapes, and then we're kind of building off of that, right? So for my oil pastel here, I'm actually going to use the yellow to kind of also demo how to do it with the basic shape. But I'm going to take the yellow and just kind of do that light mark, kind of the same that I was doing with that one. Okay. And because I want this second layer here to be that lighter color, I'm going to take my mid-tone green and just kind of make that mark and completely cover it with that yellow. And that gives me that lighter green. Okay. So let's start building that up, thinking about the darker colors, those darker spaces. If you have a dark green, you can bring that in. I'll show kind of a dark green with my oil or soft pastels. And we just want to start thinking about those different marks that we learned, those different techniques. So thinking about maybe the scumbling, where it's just doing those little marks. So adding those dark marks kind of where I'm seeing the dark marks here, right? And also remembering that the closer it is to me, the more detail, the further away, the less detail. So I'm seeing a lot of individual marks that are going to be up towards the bottom of this piece, right? And I'll see maybe stippling as it goes further back. Those marks are getting smaller, right? So we're just kind of filling in those spaces. If you have that dark green, you can do that. Keep those marks kind of abstract. If you're looking at grass, looking at this piece, you'll notice that those blades of grass are not all leaning the same direction. They're not all parallel. They're kind of abstract and going in different directions, right? So just kind of take your time to kind of fill in those marks. Okay. So I did my dark green. I'm going to come back in with a light green and do the same thing, kind of layering again, layering in those lighter spaces, kind of overlapping some of that dark green because there's some light green in there too. And know this, know that this drawing is not a perfect finished piece, right? This is kind of playing around and figuring out how to get those looks, trying out different mark making. Right? You can bring in some midtones as well. Thinking about the overlapping in the midtones. Because we have a variety of color that's here. And so we want that variety of color to start showing up. Even here, bringing some of that yellow in to get some of those highlights. We're getting a range of color, even though we're just using greens. Right? And so you see that starting to build up, right? It's not exactly the same as the drawing, but we're starting to kind of explore our mark making and the different marks that we can use to create that illusion. We don't have to draw every individual blade of grass to give the feeling that we're looking at grass, right? So it helps to have that kind of smooth base to start off with, and then just kind of gradually build up. I'm going to hop down to the oil pastels and talk a little bit about that. So if you have just a basic tray, color tray, 12, 8 or 12 individual colors, you can use like that dark blue to start giving you that dark green color. So I'm just going to kind of come in with that dark blue and do the same thing, build that mark making up. And you can see already that that dark blue, with what I'm doing, that dark blue has this illusion of a dark green because it's surrounded by these lighter greens. It kind of looks like it fits, right? It's that dark green that starting to show up. I'm just going to do the same, just kind of creating those different marks, making them go different directions, thinking about those blades of grass just in general. So I'm going to bring in my regular green and kind of overlap a little bit. And we're doing some layering, right? It gives us that illusion of depth, right? So we're just doing that kind of mark making, that simple mark making. Layering them up, creating that color range, and even coming back in with that yellow or the light green, right? And kind of adding that in to those highlights, paying attention to those highlights. And just kind of building that up. Again, it's not about making the perfect shapes, like making the perfect lines. This really is just kind of playing around. Like I said, we're just playing around today, kind of getting the feel for how to layer and how to start that landscape. So if you're still making those marks, still layering, it's not a fast process, right? It's kind of a slow process, adding that color in. And I mentioned before or earlier that sometimes it's colors that you don't expect that are kind of hiding out there. That navy is one of them. If you have like a purple, sometimes that purple is nice in those darkest darks to kind of make it feel like it's a deeper green, right? So I'm just going to take my purple, adding just a little bit of purple in those darkest dark areas, right? We don't have to use black. You can, but you don't have to. In shadows, they're not always black. They're just darker versions or other colors that create that shadow. Because we're using a lot of green, the complementary color of green is red. And so sometimes bringing that red in can give you a more natural shadow. So even if you have a little red, bringing that in to that darkest part, which I'm going to do just right here a little bit, and then overlap it with my medium green. You can see already that gives me more of a natural shadow that's showing up, right? So playing around with color can really help us understand like how to push our medium, right? And even here, like with my oil pastels, if I bring in a little red to those darker, where those shadows are, thinking about where those shadows are, bringing a little red, I can come back with my medium green and make marks right on top of it. And it gives me that much darker green now. Um, and so we'll move back just a little bit and kind of continue on. You notice there's a highlight line right across here and a little bit of highlight there. A lot of times with highlights, you can bring in like a cream color, a light yellow, or a white. And so I'm going to bring a white in for my soft pastel here and just kind of make that line, not doing like a super detailed line, but thinking about where that highlight is and stretching that across. White is also really great to use for like blending as well. So I'm just going to add a little bit of white. And you can see as I'm making those marks, it's not white that's really showing up. It's a really light green that's kind of making its appearance here. And you can see that when I do that highlight mark right across here, and even kind of up towards here, bringing that white in for that highlight. And I'm going to come back with my oil pastel here and do the same thing. Add a little bit of that white for that highlight that I'm seeing, that line. And hopefully as you're layering your colors in your drawing, you're starting to see how those colors are interacting with each other and how you can get a different color just by layering. You don't have to blend necessarily to get a variety of color. Just layering one color on top of a color can give you a different color just that way. So I'm going to kind of skip over now. If you're still layering, definitely keep doing that. I know this isn't a fast process. And this is kind of like starting, we're being inspired by our drawing, right? So no, you don't have to copy this. This is just kind of being inspired by it and playing around with those marks, right? So I'm going to move up and start with my tree here. And I can see that trunk is brown, but it has a little yellow in it. So what I'm going to do is take my soft pastel here, and I'm going to start off, I'm going to layer to get that trunk. And I'm just going to make that mark, a little brown mark, and then come back with a yellow and just layer on top of it. And I get that kind of faded brown, right? You can also use just a regular, like a light brown, yellow brown to make that mark too. And I'll do that with my oil pastel here. To do the tree, it's basically that same step that we did for the grass, thinking about that mid-tone and building off of it. And so for my soft pastel here, I'm going to do my mid-tone green and just kind of make my marks around. And then think about the light colors, where the light is hitting. Those lighter colors in, thinking about where those darker colors are sitting. We can see the lighter colors are kind of on the top, but we have some light colors kind of spread out. Right? So it's not that the top of the tree is light and the bottom of the tree is dark. It's kind of dispersed, right? It's because a tree isn't a solid sphere, right? It's made up of several, basically. So you're getting light colors all throughout that tree. And even adding a little yellow, right? Or a little white to that highlight. We're getting that range of color. So I'm going to bring for my oil pastels that little bit, my mid-tone green. Right? I'm going to use my yellow to make those lighter greens. Moments. And then I'm going to use my navy to give me those darker moments in my tree. And because it's further away, right, we don't see a lot of detail like we did up close with our grass. Yeah. So this is something, again, I'm not done. I'm going to play some more with this one, add to it. But I want to encourage you to do the same as well. Continue to add to this landscape. This exercise, I think, will be really helpful. You don't have to do it during the week. I'm not a fan of, of homework, so I totally am not requesting that everyone does this during the week. But if you want to play around, if you find time to actually nurture this practice, I definitely want to recommend doing this exercise. So this is a technique that I do often when I'm creating a landscape or a still life or anything really. It's to create some grids, right? Some smaller studies. What this does is it kind of gives us an opportunity to play, to try things out. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off and I'm just going to make a grid on my paper. Right. So I've got some small squares here. What I want to encourage us to do is to kind of try out different types of landscapes. Think about a range of detail, doing a lot of detail in the front, the part that's closest to us, losing that detail the further back we go, bringing in colors you wouldn't expect. I have this color I'll share in my palette here, my soft pastel palette that I really like, and I haven't found a way to use it yet. So I was thinking maybe if I played around with some landscapes today, this color might work. So try out different colors as well. But what I want to encourage us to do, we can start now or you can start it later if you like, is to create smaller landscapes. Trying out different colors, trying out different ranges of detail, maybe different setups. But by playing around and kind of filling that page with examples of landscapes, different types of landscapes, it does a couple things for us. One, it gets us even more familiar with our tools, right? By playing around, doing these small studies of landscapes, we get more familiar with our tool. We get practice layering, we get practice mark making, and we get to experiment a little bit. This is where creativity comes. When you get to experiment, you may find that, like for me, this color, I may find by trying to add it in my landscapes, I may find that this is my new landscape color, and I'm going to be adding it into everything. It's just kind of a time to kind of play around with it too. I'm going to start with my landscape here, just doing kind of a mid-tone green, right? And then just, again, we're just kind of playing with our landscapes, right? Doing my mid-tone color. We're not basing it off of anything, but I'm going to think about the lightest lights, the darkest darks, and the most detail being close, and then losing that detail the further back I go. So I may start thinking about like my light colors coming in, just kind of layering that a little bit and thinking about like maybe I'm doing some mountains here, maybe building that landscape up, right? Layering those colors. I'm not thinking about detail necessarily, like individual blades of grass. I'm just kind of playing around with different landscapes, different mark making, right? Using those darker darks to kind of create. Maybe thinking about how to bring tree lines in. Take some time to just kind of play around with the different mark making, right? Doing this exercise really does give us the opportunity, like I said, to understand how far we can push our tools, right? The different marks that they can make, the different ways they can layer up, right? And let's say maybe thinking about a tree line at the end of this detail. So I'm going to take um, some green and just kind of draw a tree line in the distance. I'm not trying to make this perfect, right? The point of this process is not about making it perfect, but it's playing around with the different things that we can do in landscapes. It's kind of like a testing, right? And so you can see just with what I'm doing here in that first square, right? I'm playing around with the grass, different colors. I'm playing around with adding trees in the distance, maybe bringing in some lights and darks, but taking some time to just kind of play with your different marks that you can make. Um, it really is helpful in the long run. You may find this is how I want to always do my landscapes, kind of test it out like this. And that's good too. Think about where the light is coming from in your drawing. Think about layering and blending. Think about where those highlights are and the shadows are, where you can bring in some of the detail and where you can kind of leave some of that detail off. You don't have to pull in all that detail in the beginning. When we add too much detail, sometimes that piece gets too busy and it's hard to read. Take some time with it, just kind of practicing. I can't tell you how many pages in my sketchbook are just a bunch of grids or like the same tree over and over again, or working on like a hand over and over again. The more you do it, the more comfortable you'll feel, the more understanding you have in your tool, right? So maybe I want to think about um, playing around with like maybe a cedar tree. So I want to kind of practice doing a few of them, right? Think about what that looks like, right? Noticing where the sun is, the light is coming from, and thinking about where you can add in those darker tones, right? Where you can add in those highlights. It gives you some time to kind of practice with it and play with it. This is like a low stakes way to understand your tools, understand your medium, and figure out how you want that to look. Maybe you want some detail, but you're not quite sure how to make that happen. Having this page of practice, right, can really help you figure out how to make your drawing as well. And again, like I said, it's a kind of a low stakes way to do that. Layering, practicing those different marks, the scumbling, the stippling, the layering, the blending. Mm. It doesn't have to be perfect. This really is just kind of a practice, right? It's just kind of playing around with those different colors, um, those different marks. But the more you play around with that, the more confident, like I said, the more confident you'll feel in that mark making. Kind of play with that. So if you are still working, definitely continue to work. Keep working on the grid, keep working on the original landscape. Practice layering, maybe practice doing it a couple times. Maybe look at the landscape you have out your window and try and practice that, or a photo of a landscape that you enjoy or that has meaning for you. But take some time to kind of play around with that. We are going to talk about the sky, but if you want to go ahead and add a sky in, I'm thinking about adding sky to this. It may smudge the trees, but a way around that is I'm going to kind of start with my blue here. Adding, like I'm going to do some blue here. I can take that tortilla or the smudging stick and just kind of bring it in, right? Bring that base color in so it's not smudging trees, but I'm still getting it behind there. You can do that with a Q-tip or your finger. My fingers are a little messy right now, so do it with that. You also can utilize your paper color, and we'll talk more about this next week as well. But utilize your paper color in the sky making, so you don't have to color it in completely. Sometimes you have a clear sky, sometimes it's full of clouds, and so just adding like little bits of blues, not necessarily smudging that in, can be enough to give that kind of background color. Sometimes it's helpful to do the sky as you're doing the background. We started off with our drawings. We did that mid-tone color for the landscape, and then kind of smudged that, used our finger or blending some to kind of smudge it and mix it in. And that may be a good time to do the sky too. I always find for me, leaving the sky for last because I never know like how many clouds, how much blue, and sometimes that clearer background kind of takes away or adds to your landscape. So a lot of times I'll save it for the end, but you can do it in the beginning, you can do it in the middle. There's really no like rule, you have to do it at a certain time. And because we have these other tools like our fingers or the tortilla and the Q-tip, the blending stump, we have the freedom to blend however later on without causing any kind of smudging to our other work. You can also bring in that workable fixative and spray as you go because you can work on top of this too. So if you find like, oh, my trees are perfect here, I'm going to spray that down before I start my sky. You can do that and it protects your trees. I know this is not like the ideal cedar tree, but for like a study, this is a great way to kind of practice bringing those dark tones in with those lighter tones. And so I'll just do one cedar tree, but I'm starting with my mid-tone green. And I'm just kind of, I know not all cedars are like triangles, but for the purpose of practice, I'm creating my mid-tone. And then I actually came in with a navy, but you can do a dark green. And I'm thinking about, just for the purpose of my drawing here, I'm thinking about my light coming from this direction. And so my darkest tones are going to be on that opposite side. And so I'm going to think about bringing that kind of dark tone in. So bringing that dark tone, just kind of going down and just kind of bringing that dark tone in, knowing that I'm going to have more down at the bottom, the opposite of where that light is. And so I'm going to see some of those dark tones more on that left side. You can do that with like a regular blue or a dark green. And then for the light side, I'm going to think about, you can bring in like a light green and just kind of add those highlights. And I'm just doing some scumbling here, just those scratchy marks, and overlapping just a little with the darker. Thinking about those lighter colors are going to be on the side closest to the sun. And then taking that yellow and just kind of layering it. Okay. So you can see the darker, let me bring my pointer in. You can see that darker color is kind of all on this side, opposite of the sun, and it's kind of stretching around a little bit, right? And then that lighter color is coming in. We're going to see more of that lighter color here. So the lighter color is going to be right across this way, kind of here and here, right? So when we bring that highlight in, that highlight, that white, I'm going to put that on the places where it's going to get the most sun, that most light. So let me I'm going to pull out a piece of sandpaper. So if your pastels came with sandpaper, you can use that in a couple ways. One, it helps trim your blending stump, right? So it helps bring that to a point again. The next way to use it is let's do green. You can use it to create texture, basically. So using that pastel, and you can see it's kind of adding that texture to it. Okay. So you've got this kind of speckly look. This is good when you're drawing things like trees, you're doing bark, you're thinking about spots on eggs, you're thinking about, I mean, this has kind of a way to um, like add a different type of mark making. I think we covered that in techniques a little bit when we talked about techniques, but that sandpaper helps with that. Sandpaper also helps you get to a point again with your soft pastels. It's not something I use super often with pastels, but that sandpaper is helpful in that way. I do want to encourage you to finish your drawings, maybe finish those grids, thinking about like the colors you're using and the shapes, and thinking about atmospheric perspective, kind of playing around with different landscapes in those grids. And then definitely going back to that first landscape we started, where we were being inspired by that photo. We're going to end our series with skies and clouds. I know clouds are tough in drawing, they're tough in painting, they're tough in like anything, clouds are tough. So we're going to end our series talking about that so we can finish our landscape that we started today. Thank you everyone for being a part of today. Thank you so much. And if any questions come up, always feel free to jump in and ask, or email us at our contact@Mather email or on our Facebook page. We're happy to answer as many questions as we can.